Welcome to episode 318 of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. I am Dave Deacon, and we got a really cool episode for you. Today on the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast, we have a bonus episode of sorts because we're talking with our own Dr. Brian Arnell about the upcoming winter CCA crop school. But before we do that, go ahead and bump that subscribe button where you get your podcast. And remember, you can find all of the information that we talk about on this episode and past episodes on our website, reddirtagronomy.com. And there you will find a link to watch past sessions of the winter CCA crop school and a link to this year's registration where there are still a couple of spots available. And without further ado, we jump into our conversation with Dr. Brian Arnell. You are listening to the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. So, Brian, this week we're doing kind of a bonus on the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast, taking a look back at some of the previous winter crop schools that you've had. And one that stood out was about the nutrient cycling, because whenever you bring in a guest to talk at the winter crop school, they're there for a very specific reason to kind of cover something that Oklahoma producers and folks who use the CCAs that can help them with their studies, with their consulting as well.
Yeah, we like outside speakers. One, you can't be a prophet in your own backyard.
That's
so
true.
you bring in outside ideas, outside thoughts. And so in this one we're about to highlight, we have Dr. Joseph Burke from Texas A&M. He comes in and dives in. I asked him to do a deep dive on nutrient cycling with cover cropping, because our traditional monocrop system, the system idles between crops. And so we're used to the nutrient cycling in that system. Once you introduce a cover crop, now you have nutrients being taken up. You may have nutrients redistributed. And so Dr. Burke Joseph goes into how does cover crops influence nutrient cycling.
And of course, this is one of the past episodes or the past presentations of the Winter Crop School here. And the name has been kind of altered. For years it was Winter Crop Schools, but it's become more specific, the Winter's CCA Crop School. One reason we're bringing this up now is because there's still registration available for this.
Absolutely. Registration's open for the 2024 Winter CCA Crop School, which is going to be December 17th and 18th on the Stillwater campus. We also have December 16th, the CCA Prep. One of the reasons we really pushed the name change is that this is primarily for CCAs to get their CEUs. We welcome all farmers, ranchers, and educators. But the point of this is we want this to be high level, right? So we want this to be above what you'd get at a general county meeting. We're telling our speakers to come in, give an advanced, that next level presentation, and we have a wide diverse of audience. So don't think that you're not capable and available. A lot of farmers, a lot of ranchers come in from Texas and Kansas, and so it's really a great opportunity to learn something different.
So as you're listening to this, we're going to play probably about 15, 20 minutes of his presentation. As you're listening to this, be sure and go to wintercropsschool.com, and you can find out more information, watch past presentations, all right there, and we'll have a link to where you can sign up for this year's Winter CCA Crop School. So without further ado, Dr. Joseph Burke of Texas A&M.
And so then I took this one in 2021. This was at 11 a.m. in the morning, okay? So the street lights were on, you couldn't see, and I was an undergrad in 2011 in the drought in West Texas, and we had similar storms to this. And I was really fortunate that I was taking chemistry at the time, because I always had my chemistry goggles in my backpack, because I could walk around with my chemistry goggles to keep the dust out of my eyes. And so I say this not to say that we're not doing a good job at controlling wind erosion in West Texas, because we've reduced wind erosion in Lubbock and the surrounding counties by 80% since 1930. So since the Dust Bowl, we have stopped wind erosion by 80%. But in extreme years, both good and bad years, we still have rain events like this. 2019, this picture here, this was taken after one of our wettest springs that we had in West Texas on record. right? So even in a wet spring, we have dust storms. Even in a dry spring, we also have dust storms. And for us, that's where it comes into understanding the benefits of cover crops. And so for us, cover crops are not about controlling weeds. They're not about improving moisture or improving organic matter. It is purely the physical benefit of keeping the soil covered so it doesn't blow. Unfortunately, it's really hard for me to get my producers to adopt those same conservation practices. So this is a figure taken from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. There should be an update this year, so I'm hoping to have some better data. But this is looking at cover crop or reduced tillage adoption across the region. And as you can see that even in Lubbock, we're sitting around 5 to 10% cover crop adoption, right? And so in our biggest cotton producing counties, there's very little. Also, there's a lot of counties that don't even have any data because people aren't reporting what's going on there. And so I will encourage you all, as you talk to people, please encourage them to fill out the Census of Agriculture. Sometimes it's the only good data that we have in the communities that we're working in. But I just want to highlight this as just to show how little of these practices that we can benefit from a wind erosion reduction practices are even being implemented in our area. Also to note, so I should have included all of Oklahoma. This figure was designed for a regenerative agriculture grant that we ended up receiving that focuses on regenerative practices for cotton production in this area. All three of our hosts today from Oklahoma State are a part of this project. And I talked about this yesterday, but it also just makes it a challenge in cotton production to get that cover crop implemented and up and survive our first freeze here in November or sometimes even in December before we have to terminate it per our recommendations from NRCS. So it makes it a challenge for us to implement these practices in West Texas. And so if I can take you back to your intro soils class for a second, one of the things that we struggle with cover crops is understanding the mineralization and immobilization timeline. And so a cover crop is primarily what two things? Chemically. Anybody want to throw out an answer? All right, it's a little early, but it's mostly carbon, right? And so when you add carbon to a system, you have to balance that with a certain amount of nitrogen, or else you're going to get immobilization. And so for us, it's about trying to determine at what point is that cover crop going to serve as an organic nitrogen source and or inorganic nitrogen source. And we want both. We want the balance between those two systems because it allows our microbes to be fed and then our plants to be fed as well. And so what we're focusing on is mineralization, which is the conversion of organic nitrogen to inorganic nitrogen that's plant available. And then immobilization is the conversion of that inorganic form back to an organic form that's not available for plants to take up. Now there is some work that's being done that suggests that plants can take up small amounts of organic nitrogen, but that hasn't really been proven in the broad scale of things. So we're going to again focus on the two inorganic forms of nitrogen that plants can use, nitrate and ammonium. And what happens is when you have different forms of biomass in the field, based on that C to N ratio, a certain amount of that is either going to be immobilized or mineralized. And so it's important for us to understand at what point we terminate our cover crop to allow that to happen. What complicates this and what the data is showing moving forward is that it's not just necessarily the C to N ratio or the amount of carbons or nitrogens in that plant material, but it's actually the structural composition of those carbons. So is that carbon in cellulose, hemicellulose, or lignin? And what we see is that most of our biomass is showing at like 13 to 1 C to N ratio, which should mineralize very quickly. But because we have primarily stalks in our cover crops when we terminate them, that's lignin. And those lignins are very slow to decompose in the field. And so how does this work out practically? So this was a study that was conducted in Ag Cares and it was published in 2004, but it's work from 1998 to 2001. And it looked at in a conservation tillage system, or it was essentially no-till, but they had to do a few early tillage practices with a cover crop relative to conventional tillage. And what it showed is that with conventional tillage, the optimum nitrogen rate was 35 pounds of nitrogen per acre for a bale of cotton. Or for 2 bale cotton. And then for conservation tillage, it was actually 30 pounds more, right? So 30 pounds more nitrogen was needed following that cover crop to achieve the same cotton lint yield relative to a conventionally tilled system. And so, like all good researchers, we took exactly what had been done before and we just decided to do it better with new tools. And so this is a similar system that we looked at yesterday, comparing 3 continuous cotton systems. So conventional tillage, winter fallow, no tillage with a rye cover, and then no tillage with the mixed species cover. Now this is usually when I would be at a different meeting and a different crowd, but I would make my joke about the really expensive rye cover. And so you've already heard that one. But remember, we did include some legumes in that system, and we had hoped that that could offset some of that nitrogen mineralization, or that nitrogen immobilization. And what's also important to note is we only planted that cover at 40 pounds to the acre. Some recent research has shown that you can drop that down to even 20 pounds in our systems to the acre and get the same benefit as having a 40-pound seeding rate. And then we soil sampled at multiple depths just to compare, which will come up here in a second. So yesterday I briefly highlighted this, but wanted to talk about our herbage mass production. Since that's going to be the focus of today, we'll spend a little bit more time on this slide. Just note that in all but 1 year, the no-till rye outperformed the no-till mixed, and that was just based on the seeding rate essentially of those systems. The year that it did not perform well, we thought that it would be a good idea to buy our mixed species cover from a different company, and we ended up not getting Elbon rye, we ended up getting like a tillering rye, and it just did terribly, it very poorly grew, so it's just not a good year for that one. But what I want to highlight too is when we look at stability analysis, and we talked about this yesterday, about if it's greater than 1, that slope of that line, it's going to be a more stable system. If it's less than 1, it's going to be a less stable system. So with rye, our rye is a more consistent performer for us, and we just think it's because of that seeding rate, that a little bit more of it planted means a little bit better stands in these systems. And it does relate back to yield, right? And so we do see a yield reduction in a few years following a cover crop relative to the conventionally tilled system. And yesterday we focused on the fact that we didn't think that it was water, because while we do have these periods where the cover crop significantly reduces the amount of soil moisture in our system, following that cover crop termination, we see a significant increase in water storage capacity, and that remains throughout the rest of the growing season. And we see that in each of the years that we produce this crop. So if it's not necessarily water, or water is not the most important factor for what's limiting yield in these systems, what else could it be? And so we settled on nutrient decomposition and nitrogen availability. So to do this, it gets really complicated. You actually just you cut the biomass out of the field, you put it in these little litter bags. So the screen mesh on these litter bags prohibits insects and mites from getting inside of it, but it allows oxygen and microbes to move through. So it essentially simulates what microbial decomposition of these residues would be in the field. So I cut it, took it back to the lab that night, weighed out what it was, and then to a field scale, so our bags were 15 centimeters by 20 centimeters, so I calculated how much biomass in the field was growing in that same area, took a representative sample of biomass, put it in the bags, sealed the bags with a heat sealer, and then I tethered them with these nails in the field to simulate what surface level decomposition would be. Now, there's going to be a few critics in the room that said I should have buried my litter bags so that way I could simulate microbial interactions, but remember this is a no-till system, and so we're not going to introduce that cover crop into the soil solution itself, and so it's important for us to represent what is the slowest or the most microbial rate of decomposition. And then I retrieved these litter bags at set periods throughout the growing season. They were great in theory, they're very expensive, they're like $15 a bag. And then I have a farm manager who I'm pretty sure despises any research trial that I come up with. And in a no-till system, he managed to hit them with a plow. I don't know how that works. But anyway, so I was able to recover enough to statistically significant, but I went from 12 litter bags per sample collection to 6 litter bags per sample collection because of the plowing event. And then I collected soil samples directly beneath the litter bags to simulate what is going on in the soil community following that collection. All right, so we're going to talk about cover crop decomposition, all right? And so I have it presented here as remaining biomass throughout the year, and this is days after cover crop termination. The gray line is going to represent when we planted cotton. So imagine this is how much biomass was remaining at cotton planting date. 2020, we had lots of biomass. 2021, we did not have as much biomass. And look at the differences in decomposition rate between 2 years. So in 2020, at cotton planting, we still had 90% of the biomass remaining in the field at cotton planting. That's 8 weeks after cover crop termination. 8 weeks, and we still had 90% of the biomass remaining. Now, keep that number in mind. We only decomposed 10% at cotton planting, okay? Then we fast forward to 2021, and at cotton planting, and this is also, 2021 was a weird year. No one should plant cotton 90 days after cover crop termination. We have this thing in West Texas pretty frequently called inland hurricanes. Has anyone ever heard of one of those? And so it's essentially a micro downburst where we had 175 mile per hour winds that drop down in like a half-mile area. And so it's essentially called an inland hurricane. Wiped out our cotton crop in mid-June. I replanted cotton on July 4th because I had to have something to defend for my dissertation. And so normally I would not recommend planting cotton in West Texas on July 7th, but for research purposes, I needed to graduate. And so anyway, that's what this line represents, as a really late planting date. So if we look back at about 50 days, we were still at around 35%, and we didn't decompose much more after that. Now, what I want to note is 128 days after cover crop termination is about peak nutrient uptake for us in West Texas, for our cotton crops, and we're still here at 80% undecomposed, okay? And here, we're looking at the same time frame. We had decomposed all but about 30%. And so those numbers are important when we go here. And we talk about the nutrients that can be released from that. And so this is a theoretical amount of nitrogen that can be released following cover crop termination using just C to N ratios. So we're going to focus on 2020 because it was actually a good year. But essentially, this is how much biomass we produce. So a little over 4,000 pounds to the acre of dry matter. So that's a good cover crop, right? That's really good for us in West Texas. And at a percent nitrogen of 3, essentially, we could have mineralized 128 pounds of nitrogen. What is a yield goal for cotton production in Oklahoma? Let's not talk about Altus because they can produce all kinds of crazy numbers. But in a dryland cotton situation, what is the yield goal here? 2 bale to the acre, bale and a half? And so you would have more than enough nitrogen in 2020 just from your cover crop decomposing to produce a 2 bale cotton crop, even a 3 bale cotton crop in West Texas, if you got all of your nitrogen just from the cover. Unfortunately, we have to look at how much of that nitrogen is actually going to be released during the growing season. And remember back here, when we're looking at our decomposition rate at cotton planting, we're only at about 85% decomposed. So even at the best of times, we're looking at around 20 pounds of nitrogen that's going to be released from that cover crop at cotton planting. So what's happening is microbes are tying up the nitrogen in that cover crop, or any nitrogen that we add to the system, and it's limiting our cotton production in West Texas, especially early on. And one of the things that I asked Brian about yesterday is our work in West Texas shows that modern cotton varieties take up less nitrogen, but they take it up about 3 weeks earlier than their historical counterparts. And so our nutrient recommendations, if you're not shifting your fertilizing practice earlier in the season, especially following a cover crop, you're not going to be able to balance the nitrogen that those plants need. Now, can anyone foresee a risk associated with putting your nitrogen on earlier in a season when we have really rough climatic events, right? So there's a risk that the producer has to take early on in the growing season. I'm going to show you that risk here in a second, of you may not produce a crop, but you've still already invested in nitrogen in that system to try to offset following a cover crop. Okay. So then looking forward, so these are some soil samples we collected. This is looking at soil proteins. I'm not going to bore you with the chemistry of this, but essentially proteins are organic nitrogen sources in soil, and then also our inorganic nitrogen fractions. What's interesting to note is so this number right here, you see the spike shortly after decomposition. This is that mineralization of nitrogen. So these are microbes that are releasing nitrogen back into the system. And then subsequently at our next sampling point, we see an increase in inorganic nitrogen. So we're actually seeing this mineralization and immobilization happening in the field. Now, one of the deficits of my system is we fertigate our nitrogen over the top of the entire system through the pivot. And so after about 50 days, I couldn't see any differences because on day 52, they put about 35 pounds of nitrogen out just through the pivot. So I can't tell what the nitrogen dynamics were in my system just from a soil perspective because we had an increase in the amount of nitrogen fertilization. But what's important to note is that proteins can help us track this mineralization immobilization time frame. All right, and then the economics, I got this question yesterday, does it pay? So this is looking from 2015 to 2017. The results are almost identical in 2018 through 2020. What we see is that numerically the continuous cotton conventional till system does yield greater gross margin for us, so more money per acre. However, there's no significant difference. So out of 8 years, there was no significant difference in these systems. However, the conventionally tilled system regularly produced more cotton or better cotton, I would say, on average. And this does use the loan value as that calculation for economics. So those are small plots, right? 16 rows wide, 200 feet long. There's some deficit in using small plot research, especially for economics. So we wanted to look at cropping system scale size, so using an entire pivot span. What would we look at for the same idea? And we took the results from the study that we had with the cover crops and designed this system, where we wanted to take that nitrogen fertilization period and optimize it for cotton production following a cover crop. And so in Texas, right now, our fertilizer recommendation is that if you're going to follow a cover crop, you add an extra shot of nitrogen at pinhead square, okay? And so for us, we thought that was a little bit too late, so getting a little bit late in the growing season, especially following a cover crop. So we designed this system to where we worked in three areas. So the continuous cotton winter fallow, so business as usual, our continuous cotton rye cover crop system, and then a cotton wheat fallow rotation where 1 year would always have cotton on one of the wedges. And then we compared that to 4 different fertilization practices. The farmer's practice, which is 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then because it was fertigated at the time, we couldn't optimize the system, so we added the 30 pounds of nitrogen. So that comes up into the cost. But essentially, we added 30 pounds either pre-plant, so 2 weeks before planting, 3 weeks after post-emergence, or pinhead square plus 2 weeks, which is the current extension recommendation in Texas. So either 120 pounds or 150 pounds at different timings. And so these are the results for that. And so it's a little bit of a busy figure, but essentially we have our systems that are running horizontally. So our continuous cotton system, business as usual, our cover crop system here, and then our cotton wheat fallow rotation. And then running vertically, we have our different nitrogen fertilization practices. So our farmer's practice, our pre-plant nitrogen, our post-emergence, and then our pinhead square. And what we see is that following a cover crop, you see the added benefit of adding that nitrogen earlier in the growing season than later in the season. So that pinhead square application is too late for us compared back to a conventionally tilled system. However, what's interesting to note is with the cotton wheat fallow rotation, you don't see an added benefit of additional nitrogen.
Thank you for listening in on this preview of the Winter CCA Crop School on this bonus episode of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. If you get a chance, visit our website, reddirtagronomy.com, to find more information about our guest and any of the resources we discussed on the podcast today. I'm Dave Deacon, and thank you for listening. The proceeding is a copyrighted recording of Agnow Media, LLC, 2024. And yes, all rights are reserved.